When I use the word mysticism, I'm referring to a kind of experience, a kind of, shall we say, state of consciousness, which seems to be as prevalent among human beings as measles. It's something that simply happens, and we don't know why it happens, and although there are all sorts of techniques which claim to be able to promote it, and which are more or less successful in doing so, and sometimes rather less than more, nevertheless there is this peculiar thing that happens to people. And it's been recorded as far back in time as we have any recording at all. And that is coming over people the peculiarly convincing sensation that their ordinary sense of individuality, of personal identity, is transcended. And the individual suddenly feels an experience that actually it could be described from a number of quite different points of view. But we could add up these dominant characteristics. That instead of the ordinary feeling that I as an individual confront a world that is foreign to me, that is not me, in this kind of experience I find myself to be of one and the same nature or identity as the world outside me. In other words, I suddenly feel no longer a stranger in the world, but as if the external world were my own body. Now, of course, everything is fundamentally in harmony with the Tao. In the book called the Zhongyong, or the Unwobbling Pivot, it is said, the Tao is that from which nothing can depart. That from which things can depart is not the Tao. Fundamentally, you see, you can't get away from it. It's a situation in which we are all floating in a tremendous river, and the river carries you along. Now, some of the people in the river are swimming against it, but they're still being carried along. Others have learned that the art of the thing is to swim with it, and they're carried along too, but they know it. And so in this way, to a person who really wakes up, you very soon realize that your existence is not something that is just the hopeless little creature that's suddenly confronted with a great big external world that goes gah at him, and eats him up. Every tiniest little thing that comes into being, every minute little fruit fly or gnat or bacterium, I will go so far as to say is an event upon which this whole cosmos depends. This universe consists of an arrangement of pattern in which every event is essential to the whole thing. Now, we screen that idea out of our consciousness in exactly the same way that we screen out the perception of space as an important reality. Just as we pay attention to the figure and ignore the background, so we see one way of looking at things, namely that the organism is very frail against the environment. It lasts a long time, the environment, but the organism only lasts a short time. And yet there is the environment just as the same way as there is the face in the newspaper photograph behind all those little dots. When you get far enough away from it, you see the face. When you get far enough away from all the organisms and the little bits of things, you see the environment. This is Alan Watts speaking, and I'm this evening on my ferry boat the host to a fascinating party sponsored by the San Francisco Oracle, which is our new underground paper. And we have here Alan Cohen representing the paper, the Oracle. We have Allen Ginsberg, poet and rabbinic sadhu. We have Timothy Leary, about whom nothing needs to be said, and Gary Snyder, also poet, Zen monk, and old friend of many years. Well, I think that thus far the genius of this kind of underground that we're talking about is that it has no leadership. The Western world has labored for many, many centuries under a monarchical conception of the universe, where God is the boss, and political systems and all kinds of law have been based on this model of the universe, that nature is run by a boss. If you take the organic view of the world, they would say, for example, that the human body is an organization in which there is no boss. It is a situation of order resulting from mutual interrelationship of all the parts. And what we need to realize is that there can be, shall we say, a movement, a stirring among people, which can be organically designed instead of politically designed. Do you remember the Great Depression, when one day everybody was doing business and things were going along pretty well, and the next day there were bread lines? It was like someone came to work and they said to him, "Sorry, chum, but you can't build today. No building can go on. We don't have enough inches." He said, "What do you mean we don't have enough inches? We got wood, haven't we? We got metal, we even got tape measures." He said, "Yeah, but you don't understand the business world. We just haven't got enough inches, just plain inches. We've used too much of them." And that's exactly what happened when we had the Depression. Because money is something of the same order of reality as inches, grams, meters, pounds, or lines of latitude and longitude. It is an abstraction. It is a method of bookkeeping to obviate the cumbersome procedures of barter. But our culture is entirely hung up on the notion that money has an independent reality of its own. And this is a very striking, concrete example of what I'm going to talk about, of the way we are bamboozled by our thoughts, which are symbols, and what we can do to become unbamboozled. Another example of this fantastic confusion is that not so long ago, the Congress voted a law imposing stern penalties upon anyone who should presume to burn the American flag. And they put this law through with a great deal of patriotic oratory and quoting of poems and so on about Old Glory. ignoring the fact entirely that these same congressmen, by acts of commission or omission, are burning up that for which the flag stands. They are allowing the utter pollution of our waters, of our atmosphere, the devastation of our forests. But you see, they don't notice the difference between the flag and the country. Or as Korzybski pointed out, the difference between the map and the territory. Compare a physical globe and a political globe. The physical globe is a pretty thing with all kinds of green and brown, wiggly patterns on it. The political globe, on the other hand, has still got the wiggly outlines of the land, but they are all crossed over with colored patches, many of which have completely straight edges. A lot of the boundary between the United States and Canada, once you get west of the Great Lakes, is simply a straight line. It is absolutely a violation of the surface of the territory. And look at the fair city of San Francisco. It's a lovely place, but they planted on the hills of San Francisco a city pattern that was appropriate for the plains of Kansas, a gridiron. And so you get streets that go straight up and that are extremely dangerous, where they should have followed the contours of the hills. And so we put ourselves in boxes. Everything is put in boxes. But actually, everything else in nature doesn't go that way. As, for example, the snail doesn't put itself in a box. The crab doesn't put itself in a box. It has these fascinating, gorgeous objects. What is, for example, more beautiful than a conch shell or a lovely scallop shell? Well, these are gorgeous things. We could make the most delicious shells out of concrete or plastics. They could be very beautiful. And we could distribute ourselves over the landscape like shellfish along the seashore. But instead we have to live in boxes. And there's nothing, you can't fight it, it's the system. So, then you have to, you begin to build your furniture and chairs, everything, accordingly to these shapes, because they're easy to store away in a place that is a box in the first place.
A person who thinks all the time has nothing to think about except thoughts. So he loses touch with reality and lives in a world of illusions. By thoughts, I mean specifically chatter in the skull, perpetual and compulsive repetition of words, of reckoning and calculating. I'm not saying that thinking is bad. Like everything else, it's useful in moderation. A good servant, but a bad master. And all so-called civilized peoples have increasingly become crazy and self-destructive because through excessive thinking they have lost touch with reality. Most of us would have rather money than tangible wealth, and a great occasion is somehow spoiled for us unless photographed. And to read about it the next day in the newspaper is oddly more fun for us than the original event. This is a disaster. To get in touch with reality, there is an art of meditation, of what is called yoga or jhana in India, Chan in China, and Zen in Japan. It is the art of temporarily silencing the mind, of stopping the chatter in the skull.
our minds have to be silent some of the time if we are really to have anything to think about except thoughts. Just let your mind alone and stop trying to make sense of the world.
If you were in a flying saucer from Mars or somewhere and you try and make out what was living on this world, you would see these great ganglia with tentacles going out all over the place. And early in the morning, you see little blobs of luminous particles going into the middle of them, see? And then in the late afternoon or early evening, it would spit them all out again. And they'd say, well, this thing breathes. And it does it in a special rhythm. It goes in and out, in and out, in and out once every 24 hours. But then it rests a day and doesn't spit so much. It spits in a different way. That's a kind of irregularity, and then it starts spitting all over again the same way. Well, I say that's very interesting. That's this kind of thing we have. See? This is something that goes this way.
Welcome to my home. We're aboard the ferry boat Vallejo, which is tied up at the north end of Sausalito, close to San Francisco. And this is where I live. And you may think this place is rather weird. But that's because I've always loved weird things. I remember when I was a little boy, people used to say to me, "Alan, you're so weird. Why can't you be like other people?" Well, I thought that was just plain dull, like having the same thing for dinner every day. And as is well said, variety is the spice of life. So you will indeed find this place rather strange. And some of the things that are weird because they are just obvious and nobody ever thinks of them. Some of the most fascinating scientific discoveries have been made by people who called ordinary common sense in question. Like anybody can see that the earth is flat, and people know it's flat. And calling that fundamental assumption in question is really the beginning of geography. So the course of time is really very much like the course of a ship in the ocean. Because here's the ship, you see, and it leaves behind it a wake. And the wake fades out. And that tells us where the ship has been, in just the same way as the past and our memory of the past tells us what we have done. But as we go back into the past, and we go back and back to prehistory, and we use all kinds of instruments and scientific methods for detecting what happened, we eventually reach a point where all record of the past fades away in just the same way as the wake of the ship. Now, the important thing to remember in this illustration is that the wake doesn't drive the ship any more than the tail wags the dog. So therefore, in this way, if you experience this, a curious liberation from what the Hindus and the Buddhists call karma. The word karma in Sanskrit actually means doing, action. Karma comes from the root, kri, which simply means to do. And so when something happens to me, say I have an accident or an illness, and a Buddhist or a Hindu will say, well, it was your karma. In other words, the implication is you had done something wrong in the past, as a result of which you reap this unfortunate consequence in a later time. And that's not the real meaning of karma. Karma does not mean cause and effect. It simply means doing. That, in other words, you are doing what happens to you. And that, of course, depends upon how you define the word you. For example, we were talking about breathing. Am I doing it, or is it happening to me? You can look at it either way. I am growing my hair. Am I doing it, or is it happening to me? You can look at it either way. All right, I am being sick. I'm being destroyed in an accident. If I define myself as the whole field of events, we'll say the organism-environment field, which is the real me, then all the things that happen to me may be called my doing. And that is the real sense of karma. But when we speak about freedom from karma, freedom from being the puppet of the past, that simply involves a change in your thinking. It involves, in other words, you're getting rid of the habit of thought whereby you define yourself as the result of what has gone before, and instead get into the more plausible and more reasonable habit of thought, in terms of which you don't define yourself in terms of what you've done before, but in terms of what you're doing now. And that is liberation from the ridiculous situation of being a dog wagged by its tail.